Jamie never expected much from their job at the dollar store. It was a simple gig, just enough to cover rent and groceries. The late night shifts were quiet, sometimes too quiet, but they didn't mind. They liked the solitude until the night everything changed. It was a little after 10 p.m., and Jamie was doing the usual end of shift task, counting the till, straightening shelves, and making sure nothing looked too out of place for the morning crew. That's when the door chime rang. Jamie looked up, surprised. Most people didn't come in this late. The man who walked in was unusual, to say the least. His clothes were worn, with fraying edges and faint stains that looked like dried mud. His face was gaunt, hollowed by shadows that the fluorescent lights only deepened. But it wasn't his appearance that unnerved Jamie. It was the object he carried. Clutched tightly in his arms was a doll. A small porcelain-faced doll with glassy, unblinking eyes and hair that looked too real for comfort. The man wandered the aisles aimlessly, murmuring to himself. Jamie watched him out of the corner of their eye, trying to focus on finishing their task. After a few minutes, the man approached the counter. He set the doll down with an audible thud and looked at Jamie with an intensity that sent a chill down their spine. "This belongs to you," the man said. His voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. Jamie blinked, confused. No, I think you've got the wrong person," they replied, trying to keep their tone polite. The man's lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but it never reached his eyes. "You'll see," he said cryptically. Then he turned and walked out of the store, leaving the doll behind. Jamie stared at the doll for a moment, unsure of what to do. Its eyes seemed to catch the light in a way that made them look alive. With a sigh, Jamie placed it in the lost and found box under the counter. As they locked up for the night, Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They glanced over their shoulder repeatedly, but the parking lot was empty. Still, the unease lingered. The next night, things got stranger. Jamie was stocking shelves when they noticed something odd. The doll, the one they had locked in the lost and found box, was sitting on a shelf in the toy aisle. Jamie froze. They knew for a fact that no one had touched it. They'd been alone all night. Heart pounding, Jamie picked up the doll and returned it to the box, making sure to latch the lid securely. But as the night went on, more unsettling things happened. Items fell off shelves without explanation. The lights flickered intermittently, though the weather was clear. And then there was the laughter, soft, childlike giggles that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Jamie tried to rationalize. Maybe they were just tired. Maybe the old building had bad wiring. But deep down, they knew something wasn't right. The turning point came a few nights later. Jamie was sweeping the floor when a regular customer, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove, shuffled in. She was kind, always chatting about her grandchildren or the weather. But tonight she seemed different, distracted, almost nervous. As Mrs. Hargrove passed the counter, her eyes fell on the doll. She froze, her face paling. "Where did you get that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jamie hesitated. "A guy left it here a few nights ago." "Why?" Mrs. Hargrove's hands shook as she gripped the counter. "You need to get rid of it," she said. "That doll, it's not just a toy. It's connected to them." "Connected to who?" Jamie asked, their stomachs sinking. Mrs. Hargrove leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The children, the ones who died in the fire." Jamie stared at her, confusion and fear swirling in their mind. "What fire?" Mrs. Hargrove sighed, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. "This store wasn't always a dollar store. It used to be an orphanage. Decades ago, there was a fire. The children, they never made it out." Jamie tried to process her words, but before they could respond, Mrs. Hargrove turned and left, her warning hanging heavy in the air. That night, Jamie stayed late to review the security footage. They needed to understand what was happening, even if it scared them. As they scrolled through the recordings, their blood ran cold. The footage showed them moving items on shelves, speaking to someone who wasn't there, and, most horrifying of all, cradling the doll like it was a living child. Jamie had no memory of doing any of it. The next few nights were a blur of terror. The doll appeared in different places no matter how many times Jamie tried to lock it away. The laughter grew louder, and Jamie began to see shadows darting at the edge of their vision. They started hearing whispers, faint but insistent, calling their name. Finally, Jamie decided they couldn't take it anymore. They grabbed the doll, drove to the edge of town, and buried it in a shallow grave. For a moment, they felt relief, like they'd finally escaped. But when Jamie returned to the store the next night, the doll was waiting for them on the counter, its glassy eyes staring directly at them. That was the last straw. Jamie quit the job and moved to a new town, desperate to leave it all behind. For a while, things seemed normal. But one night, as Jamie was unpacking in their new apartment, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of childlike laughter. When they turned around, the doll was sitting on their kitchen counter, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Jamie's heart sank as they realized the truth. They hadn't escaped. The children had followed them, and they weren't going to let go. I'd always loved a good bargain. As a college student scraping by on a tight budget, the local dollar store was a godsend. It had everything I needed: notebooks for class, cheap snacks, and the occasional knick-knack for my cramped dorm room. But I'll never forget the night I learned that not everything comes at a price you can afford. It started with a flyer. I spotted it pinned to the community board on campus, advertising a late-night clearance sale at the dollar store. "Everything must go! 80% off select items!" screamed the bold, neon-colored letters. It sounded too good to be true. My roommate, Kayla, thought so too. "You know those sales are just to get rid of junk no one wants, right?" she said, raising an eyebrow as she scrolled through her phone. "Junk or not, it's cheap," I replied. "Besides, I could use a break from studying." So, at 11:30 p.m., I made my way to the dollar store, clutching my tote bag and mentally cataloging the things I needed. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived, which surprised me. I expected other students or bargain hunters to be swarming the place, but the only cars were an old sedan with peeling paint and a delivery truck parked in the back. The store was lit with its usual flickering fluorescent lights, casting an unsettling glow over the aisles. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Clearance items in the back." The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the silence. No muzak playing faintly over the speakers. No hum of customers murmuring to each other. Even the usual hum of the freezers sounded muted. I glanced toward the checkout counter, but there was no cashier in sight. Just an empty stool and an ancient cash register. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing faintly. No response. I shrugged it off. Maybe they were restocking or taking a smoke break. Either way, I wasn't about to let it stop me. I made my way to the back of the store, passing shelves filled with cheap trinkets and off-brand cleaning supplies. As I got closer to the clearance section, the lights seemed dimmer. I glanced up and noticed a few of the overhead bulbs had burned out, casting the aisle in shadow. The clearance items were displayed in large bins, most of them filled with the kind of junk Kayla had warned me about. Bent spatulas, expired candy, and dollar store figurines with chipped paint. But one item caught my eye. It was a mirror. Unlike everything else in the bin, the mirror was pristine, almost impossibly. Its frame was black and intricately carved with swirling patterns that seemed to twist and writhe if you stared too long. The glass itself was flawless, reflecting my image with a sharpness that felt unnatural. I reached out and touched it, half expecting the surface to ripple like water. A chill ran down my spine as my fingers brushed the frame. The metal was icy cold, as though it had been stored in a freezer. I hesitated, but something about the mirror drew me in. It felt like it was meant for me, like it had been waiting there just for me to find it. There was no price tag, but I figured it couldn't cost more than $1. I carried it to the counter, setting it down with a soft thud. "Great find," a voice said behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I hadn't heard anyone approach. Turning around, I saw an elderly man standing behind the counter. His face was pale and deeply lined, with milky white eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. His thin lips curled into a smile that didn't feel entirely friendly. Yeah," I stammered. "How much is it?" He tilted his head as though considering my question. "For you?" $1, I handed him the cash, and hurried out of the store, feeling his gaze on my back the entire time. Back in my dorm, I set the mirror on my desk. Kayla had already gone to bed, so I didn't bother waking her to show her my find. As I studied the mirror, I noticed something odd. The glass reflected my room perfectly, except for one detail. In the reflection, the door to my closet was slightly ajar. I turned around. The closet door was closed. My stomach knotted as I turned back to the mirror. The closet door in the reflection creaked open wider, revealing darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the light. My breath caught in my throat as a figure stepped out. A shadowy silhouette with long, spindly limbs and a face that was just wrong. Its eyes were too large, its grin too wide, and it moved with a jerky, unnatural gait. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but the closet door was still closed. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. For the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd hear soft knocks coming from the closet at night, even though it was empty. The mirror would show faint smudges that looked like handprints, but no matter how much I cleaned it, they wouldn't go away. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering. The words were too faint to make out, but they were coming from the mirror. As I stared at it, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they formed a single word: "Come." I couldn't take it anymore. The next day, I wrapped the mirror in a towel and threw it into the dumpster behind my dorm. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, but the peace didn't last. When I woke up the next morning, The mirror was back, sitting on my desk as though it had never left. This time, the reflection wasn't mine. It showed the same shadowy figure, standing behind me, its wide grin stretching impossibly far. I didn't even scream. I couldn't. My body was frozen, paralyzed by terror, as the figure raised a hand and pointed at me through the glass. The next thing I knew, I was waking up on the floor. The mirror shattered around me. Kayla was shaking me awake, her face pale. "What happened?" she asked. I couldn't answer. I didn't know. We cleaned up the glass and threw the pieces away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Even now, weeks later, I still hear whispers at night. Sometimes, I catch glimpses of a shadowy figure in the corner of my eye. I don't go to dollar stores anymore. Some bargains just aren't worth it. It was supposed to be a quick stop. I needed some batteries for my flashlight before heading to the cabin my friends and I had rented for the weekend. The dollar store was the only place open that late, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie red glow across the nearly empty parking lot. The streets were silent, save for the hum of the occasional car passing in the distance. The store looked just as run down as I remembered. Rows of dusty shelves and faded tiles that creaked underfoot. The air smelled faintly of mothballs and something metallic. A single cashier sat at the counter, a woman in her late 50s, tired eyes and a forced smile. She barely glanced up as I entered, her fingers tapping idly on the counter. I headed straight for the electronics aisle, walking past mismatched knickknacks and off-brand snacks. The aisle was dimly lit, and I had to squint to make out the small boxes of batteries tucked behind rows of cheap phone chargers. As I reached for a pack, I noticed something strange. A small, leather-bound notebook wedged between two stacks of merchandise. It looked completely out of place, like it didn't belong there. Its cover was worn and scuffed, and the edges of its pages were yellowed with age. Something about it drew me in, an almost magnetic pull. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked it up. The cover was blank, save for faint scratch marks that seemed to form unintelligible shapes. When I opened it, the first few pages were filled with shaky handwriting. The ink was faded but legible, and the words were written in short, frantic sentences. "They follow me. Every time I close my eyes, they're there. I can't escape them. They know where I am. If you find this, leave it. Don't take it with you." A chill ran down my spine as I flipped through more pages. Most of the entries were similar. Descriptions of shadowy figures, whispers that grew louder in the dark, and pleas for help. The final page stopped me cold. "It's too late for me, but maybe not for you. Don't look for them. Don't acknowledge them. And whatever you do, don't take this book home." I snapped the notebook shut and looked around the aisle, half expecting someone to be watching me, but I was alone. The uneasy silence of the store pressed in on me, the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing faintly. Part of me wanted to leave the notebook right there, but another part, the part that needed to know more, wouldn't let me. Against my better judgment, I slipped it into my jacket pocket, grabbed the batteries, and headed for the counter. The cashier didn't say a word as she rang me up. Her eyes lingered on me a second too long, though, and I could have sworn her expression shifted, like she knew something I didn't. I hurried out of the store, my nerves prickling with unease. The drive to the cabin took longer than expected, thanks to the winding mountain roads. By the time I arrived, the sun had already set, and the dense forest surrounding the cabin was cloaked in darkness. My friends, Emily, Jake, and Sarah, were already there, unpacking groceries and setting up the fire pit. "What took you so long?" Emily asked, handing me a beer. "I stopped at the dollar store for batteries," I said, trying to sound casual. I didn't mention the notebook. Something about it felt private, like it was my burden to bear. That night, as we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, I couldn't stop thinking about the notebook. It was still in my jacket, tucked away but impossible to forget. The air felt heavier than it should have, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. After everyone went to bed, I stayed up, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching me. Finally, I gave in to my curiosity and pulled out the notebook. Sitting on the couch by the dim glow of a lantern, I read through more of its entries. They're closer now. I can hear them breathing. They hate the light. It keeps them away, but it won't last forever. If you hear the knocking, don't answer. Never answer. As if on cue, a soft knock echoed through the cabin. My blood turned to ice. I held my breath, waiting for one of my friends to stir, but the only sound was the faint creak of the wooden walls. The knock came again, louder this time. It was coming from the front door. I set the notebook down and approached the door slowly, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. No movement, no sign of anyone or anything out there. The knock came again, this time from the back door. My heart raced as I turned around. I could see the back door from where I stood, its small window revealing only the black void of the forest beyond. But there was something else. Just for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow shift. darker than the night itself. I grabbed a flashlight and swung the beam toward the door. The knocking stopped. The cabin was silent again, but the oppressive feeling of being watched didn't go away. I didn't sleep that. Neither did my friends after I woke them up and told them what happened. At first, they laughed it off, blaming my nerves or the wind. But when the knocking started again, this time from the windows, none of us were laughing. By morning, we were ready to leave. But as we packed up the car, I realized something horrifying. The notebook was gone. "Are you sure you didn't leave it inside?" Jake asked, frowning as I rifled through my bag. "I didn't," I insisted. "I put it right here." We searched the cabin from top to bottom, but the notebook had vanished. Uneasy, we decided to leave anyway, figuring it was better to be anywhere but there. As we drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, half expecting to see something or someone watching us. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the forest closing in on all sides. And then, as we rounded a bend, I saw it. The notebook was sitting on the dashboard, its cover pristine, as if it had never been touched. A fresh entry was scrawled on the first page in handwriting that wasn't mine. "You can't run. You brought us with you." The car stalled. The forest around us grew impossibly dark, and the knocking started again, this time from the windows of the car. The dollar store had always been my go-to for quick shopping trips. It was convenient, cheap, and close to my apartment. But after what happened that night, I haven't set foot in one since. It was a Thursday evening, and I had stopped by the store to pick up a few things: laundry detergent, some snacks, and a cheap pair of earbuds. The store was mostly empty, except for a couple of employees stocking shelves and a young couple browsing the kitchenware section. The fluorescent lights flickered faintly, casting uneven shadows over the aisles. But I didn't think much of it at the time. I wandered into the home decor section, where they kept an assortment of cheap picture frames, candles, and artificial flowers. That's when I saw it: a porcelain doll, tucked away on the bottom shelf behind a stack of discounted photo albums. It didn't look like the cheap plastic dolls you'd normally find in a dollar store. This one was different. It was about a foot tall, dressed in an old-fashioned, lacy white dress. Its pale face was finely detailed, with rosy cheeks and glassy blue eyes that seemed unnervingly lifelike. The porcelain was cracked in places, giving it an aged, fragile appearance. What really caught my attention, though, was the price tag. It wasn't marked as a clearance item, but the sticker said $0, 0 cents. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the doll, turning it over in my hands. It was lighter than I expected, almost too light, as if it were hollow. Something about it felt wrong, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The cracks in its porcelain seemed to form strange patterns, almost like symbols or runes. As I stood there examining it, a voice behind me broke the silence. "Lovely, isn't it?" I jumped and turned around to see an elderly woman standing a few feet away. She was dressed in a long, dark coat, her gray hair tied back in a bun. Her face was deeply wrinkled, and her eyes had a sharp, almost piercing quality. Yeah, I said, holding up the doll. "It's kind of creepy, though. Do you know why it's marked as free?" The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Some things aren't meant to be sold," she said cryptically, "but they always find their way into the hands of those who need them." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner of the aisle. I hesitated, debating whether to take the doll, but something about it fascinated. Maybe it was the craftsman, or maybe it was the eerie allure of owning something so unusual. Against my better judgment, I decided to take it home. At the register, the cashier didn't even blink when I handed her the doll. She scanned my other items, but didn't say a word about the tag or the fact that it had no price. When I got home, I placed the doll on a small shelf in my living room. It looked strangely out of place among my modern furniture and minimal decor, but I told myself it was just a harmless trinket. That night, I started hearing noises. At first, it was faint, a soft creaking like footsteps on an old wooden floor. I dismissed it as the sound of the building settling, but then I heard it again, louder this time. It was coming from the living room. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. When I flipped on the light, the room was empty. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, except for the doll. It was no longer on the shelf. I found it sitting upright on the coffee table, its glassy blue eyes staring straight at me. My first thought was that I must have bumped the shelf earlier, knocking it off. But the way it was positioned, perfectly upright facing me, sent a chill down my spine. I picked it up and put it back on the shelf, making sure it was stable before going back to bed. But the noises didn't stop. The next morning, I woke up to find the doll in the kitchen, sitting on the counter next to the sink. Its head was tilted slightly to the side, as if it were watching me. I told myself it was impossible. No one else had access to my apartment, and I hadn't touched it since putting it back on the shelf. I shoved it into a drawer, hoping that would put an end to the strange occurrences. It didn't. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. Doors would creak open and slam shut on their own. Lights flickered even when there was no storm. At night, I'd hear whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the doll's direction. I tried to get rid of it. I threw it in the trash, but the next morning, it was back on the shelf. I burned it in a metal bucket on my balcony, watching as the flames consumed its porcelain body. But later that night, I found it sitting in my bedroom, completely intact. Desperate, I called a friend, Sarah, to come over. I needed someone else to see what I was dealing with, to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. When Sarah arrived, I showed her the doll. She laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of prank. But her expression changed when I told her everything that had been happening. "Let's just take it back to the store," she suggested. "Maybe that'll break whatever this is." I agreed. We drove back to the dollar store, the doll wrapped tightly in a blanket and stuffed into a bag. The store was busier than usual, but when we reached the home decor aisle, the elderly woman was there again, as if she'd been waiting for it. "You've brought it back," she said, her voice calm but laced with an unsettling edge. "What is this thing?" I demanded. "Why won't it leave me alone?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached out and took the doll from my hands, cradling it like a child. "Some objects carry attachments," she said finally. "This one has been searching for a home for a very long time. It seems you weren't the right fit." Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the back of the store. Sarah and I left without saying another word. I don't know what happened to the doll after that, and I don't care to find out. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, and I can't shake the feeling that it's only a matter of time before it finds me again. I never liked dollar stores. There was something about the dimly lit aisles, the rows of cheap, mass-produced junk, and the faint chemical smell that made my skin crawl. But sometimes, convenience outweighed comfort. That night, I was on my way home from work and remembered I needed candles for a power outage. A storm was rolling, and the news had warned about possible blackouts. The dollar store was the only place open at that hour. The moment I stepped inside, I felt it. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The cashier, a man in his 40s with deep-set eyes and a vacant expression, barely glanced up as I entered. I quickly made my way to the candle aisle, grabbing a pack of plain white candles and a cheap lighter. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A single black candle, sitting on the top shelf, far apart from the others. It was sleek and smooth, with no label or price tag. Something about it felt off, but I couldn't look away. Without really thinking, I reached up and grabbed it. The moment my fingers touched the wax, a chill shot through my body, and the lights overhead flickered. I almost dropped it, but something compelled me to keep holding it. At the register, the cashier finally looked at me. His eyes narrowed slightly when he saw the black candle. "Are you sure you want that?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. "Why?" Trying to keep my tone casual despite the unease creeping up my spine. He hesitated before shaking his head. "Never mind, just be careful." I didn't press him further. I paid for my items and left, the black candle tucked securely in my bag. By the time I got home, the storm had arrived. Rain pelted against the windows, and the wind howled through the trees outside. I set the candles and lighter on the kitchen counter, but the black candle felt different. It was heavier than it should have been, almost as if it were filled with something other than wax. Curiosity got the better of me. I lit it. The flame was strange, darker than any flame I'd ever seen, with a faint bluish hue at its core. It gave off little light but filled the room with a faint, sweet scent, like a mix of honey and decay. At first, nothing happened. I sat on the couch, scrolling through my phone, listening to the storm rage outside. But then I noticed the shadows. They didn't look right. The flickering flame cast strange shapes on the walls, shapes that didn't match the furniture or objects in the room. They moved unnaturally, twisting and writhing like they had a life of their own. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the dim light. But then one of the shadows moved toward me. It slid across the floor like liquid, stretching and contorting until it reached the edge of the couch. My breath caught in my throat as the air grew colder, and the faint scent of decay became overpowering. "Blow it out," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "Just blow it out." I scrambled to my feet and moved toward the candle, but the shadows seemed to respond to my movement. They surged toward me, faster now, their shapes becoming more defined, jagged, clawed, almost human. Panicking, I grabbed the candle and tried to snuff out the flame with my fingers, but it wouldn't go out. The wax burned cold, sending a sharp pain through my hand. I grabbed a towel, threw it over the candle, and smothered it. The flame vanished, and the shadows retreated. The room was silent again, save for the storm outside. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I should have thrown the candle away then and there, but I couldn't. Some part of me was drawn to it, like it had a hold on me. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched, and when I did finally drift off, I dreamt of shadows, twisting, consuming, alive. The next day, I decided to get rid of the candle. I drove to the edge of town and threw it into a dumpster behind an abandoned building. But when I got home, it was there, sitting on my kitchen counter. The wick burned down slightly as if it had been lit again. I froze, my mind racing. I knew I hadn't imagined throwing it away. It wasn't possible for it to be back. The shadows returned that night. They were bolder, faster, their movements erratic and violent. They clawed at the walls, the floors, the windows, and the candle. I couldn't stop lighting it. No matter how many times I put it away, smashed it, tried to leave it somewhere far from me, it always came back. I started seeing things in the darkness, faces hollow and twisted watching me. Whispers followed me wherever I, faint but insistent. Light it, they said. Light it and let us in. I haven't left my apartment in days. The shadows are everywhere now, even in the daylight. I can feel them pressing against me, pulling me toward the candle. I know I can't fight them forever. As I write this, the candle sits on the table in front of me, its flame burning low. The shadows are moving and growing stronger. I don't know how much longer I can. I never thought much about the dollar store down the street from my apartment. It was one of those places you'd pop into for small essentials, a pack of batteries, some cleaning supplies, or a quick snack. But after what happened last week, I'll never go there again. It was late, around 10 p.m., when I realized I was out of coffee. I had a long night of work ahead, and going without caffeine wasn't an option. The dollar store was the only place still open, so I grabbed my jacket and headed out. The store was practically deserted the fluorescent lights hummed overhead and the air inside felt stale, almost oppressive. The only other person I saw was the cashier, a young guy with headphones in, scrolling through his phone behind the counter. I made a beeline for the food aisle, passing rows of shelves stocked with cheap toys, cleaning products, and other random items. As I searched for the coffee section, something caught my eye. A door at the far end of the aisle, partially hidden behind a display of canned goods. It was strange. I'd been to this store dozens of times, but I'd never noticed that door before. It was old and wooden, with chipped paint and a tarnished brass handle. Above it, a faded sign read, "Employees Only." I don't know what compelled me to walk toward it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the eerie silence of the store that made me want to explore. Either way, I found myself standing in front of the door, staring at it. I glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then reached for the handle. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the metal seemed to vibrate faintly under my touch. I hesitated, but something urged me forward. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A faint, musty smell wafted up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I shouldn't go down there. There was no reason to, but my feet moved on their own, carrying me down the steps one by one. The air grew colder the further I descended, and the faint hum of the store above faded away. The walls were lined with exposed pipes, and the light from my phone barely penetrated the darkness. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room. It was empty, save for a single table in the center. On the table sat a large wooden box, carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. The box looked ancient, its surface worn and splintered. Something about it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there or anywhere. I should have turned around and left, but I couldn't resist the urge to open it. As I lifted the lid, a low, guttural sound echoed through the room, like the growl of some distant animal. Inside the box was a single object, an old, rusted key. I reached for it, but the moment my fingers brushed the metal, the room went pitch black. The faint light from my phone was gone, swallowed by an unnatural darkness. Panic set in as I stumbled backward, clutching the key. I could hear something moving in the darkness, soft, shuffling footsteps, growing louder and closer. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. No response, just the sound of those footsteps circling. I turned and bolted up the stairs, the key clutched tightly in my hand. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. When I reached the top of the stairs, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The cashier was still at the counter, oblivious to what had just happened. I rushed out of the store and ran all the way home, my heart pounding in my chest. But the nightmare didn't end there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the box and the strange symbols carved into it. I heard the growling sound, low and menacing, echoing in my mind. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. The same soft, shuffling footsteps I'd heard in the basement. They were coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, closer, until it stopped right outside my door. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing it toward the door. The light flickered, and for a split second I saw it. A shadowy figure, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes that stared directly at me. And then it was gone. The footsteps faded, but I knew it wasn't over. The key was still in my possession. Whatever I'd unleashed wasn't going to leave me alone. I've tried to get rid of it. I threw it in the river, buried it in the woods, even tried burning it. But every time, it reappears on my nightstand, in my pocket, on the kitchen counter. I don't know what the key unlocks. I'm too afraid to find out. But I can feel something watching, waiting for the moment I'll give in to curiosity and use it. And I know deep down that when that moment comes, it will be the end of me. It was the week before Halloween, and the dollar store down the street had everything you'd expect. Cheap decorations, costumes that looked like they'd fall apart in minutes, and shelves stacked with discounted candy. I wasn't planning to buy anything, but the eerie chill in the air that night pulled me inside. The store was nearly empty, save for a couple of bored employees stocking shelves and a single customer wandering the aisles. Something about the place felt off. The lights flickered more than usual, and the music playing over the speakers sounded distorted, like an old cassette tape warping in and out. I wandered aimlessly, unsure why I even came in. Then I saw it, a wooden mask tucked away on a dusty shelf in the back corner of the store. It didn't belong there, and that much was obvious. While everything else in the aisle screamed cheap plastic and mass production, this mask looked ancient. The wood was dark and smooth, polished to a sheen that caught the faint light. Strange symbols were carved around its edges, and the eyes, two hollow oval cutouts, seemed to stare right through me. "Creepy, huh?" came a voice behind me. I jumped and turned to see an older man, one of the store employees, standing there. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," I said, forcing a laugh. "What's the story with this thing?" He shrugged. "Came in with a shipment months ago. Nobody ever buys it." His eyes narrowed slightly. Probably best to leave it that way. I should have listened, but something about the mask drew me in. It felt wrong to leave it there, almost like it wanted me to take it. Before I could think twice, I grabbed it and headed to the register. The cashier barely looked at me as she rang it up. The mask didn't even have a price tag, so she just punched in $1 and handed me the receipt. I brought it home and set it on my coffee table, staring at it while I ate dinner. The longer I looked, the more unsettling it became. The carved symbols seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them, and the hollow eyes felt alive. By the time I went to bed, I was thoroughly creeped out. But that was nothing compared to what happened later. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was just a dream, but the voices were clear, low, guttural, and speaking a language I couldn't understand. My heart pounded as I sat up, scanning the dark room. That's when I saw it. The mask was no longer on the coffee table where I'd left it. It was propped up on my bedroom dresser, facing my bed. I told myself I must have moved it and forgotten, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. My skin crawled as I got up and carried it back to the living room, shoving it into a drawer. The whispers stopped, but I didn't sleep for the rest of the day. Over the next few days, things only got worse. The mask wouldn't stay hidden. No matter where I put it, under the bed, in a closet, even outside on the balcony, I'd find it back in my apartment, always in a place where it could watch me. And the whispers, they grew louder, more insistent. One night, I woke up to find the mask on the pillow beside me, its hollow eyes inches from my face. I screamed and threw it across the room, but when it hit the wall, it didn't fall. It just stayed there, suspended in the air, as if something invisible was holding it. That was when I realized it wasn't just a mask. It was alive, desperate. I tried to get rid of it. I drove out to a remote field and buried it deep in the ground. But by the time I got home, it was waiting for me on the kitchen counter. I tried burning it, smashing it, even throwing it in a river. Nothing worked. The mask was indestructible, and it always came back. Then the dream started. Every night, I'd find myself standing in a dark forest, the trees twisted and gnarled like skeletal hands, reaching for the sky. The mask would be there, floating in the air, its hollow eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "Wear me," it would whisper in that guttural voice. "Set me free." I always woke up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I knew I couldn't keep it, but I didn't know what else to do. Last night, the whispers came while I was awake. They filled my apartment, echoing off the walls, growing louder and louder until I thought I'd go insane. I couldn't take it anymore. I picked up the mask, my hands trembling, and stared into its empty eyes. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving inside, shadows twisting and writhing, like they were waiting for me. "Wear me," the voice hissed again, louder this time. "Let me in." Against my better judgment, I lifted the mask and put it on. The moment it touched my face, everything changed. A searing pain shot through my skull, and I felt something cold and slimy slither into my mind. My vision blurred, and I heard laughter, low, guttural, full of malice. When I finally ripped the mask off, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was in the forest from my dreams, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels. The mask was gone, but its presence lingered, heavy and oppressive. And then I realized I wasn't alone. Figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hidden behind masks, just like the one I'd worn. Their hollow eyes glowed in the darkness, and they moved toward me in perfect unison. I don't know what they want or how to escape. All I know is that I shouldn't have taken that mask, and now I'm trapped. It was a regular Tuesday night when I decided to swing by the dollar store on my way home from work. I didn't need anything in particular, just the usual impulse buys, a pack of gum, some cheap cleaning supplies, maybe a bottle of soda. The store had always felt like a safe, if somewhat creepy place. Dim lights, aisles that always seemed a little too narrow, and the ever-present smell of stale air and cardboard. But I wasn't expecting anything strange that night. I'd been in and out of that store dozens of times, but for some reason, that night felt different. As soon as I walked through the automatic doors, I felt a weird sensation crawl up my spine. The shelves seemed taller, the air thicker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The store was nearly empty, just one elderly woman in the back aisle picking through cans, and a young man with a hoodie at the counter. The usual mix of disinterested employees stared at their phones as I passed by. I moved toward the back, past the aisles filled with cleaning products and snacks. That's when something caught my eye. A small wooden box sitting by itself on the bottom shelf of one of the aisles. It didn't belong there. I stopped and knelt down to get a closer look. The box was carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize, and it had a faded, almost greasy feel to it. The wood itself was dark, weathered with age, and covered in a fine layer of dust. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up, feeling an odd weight in my hands. It was heavier than it looked, and something about it felt wrong. I glanced around quickly, but no one seemed to notice. I was about to put it back when the cashier called out to me, "You found it." I froze, my hand still clutching the box. The young man was staring directly at me, his eyes wide and his expression odd. "You should put that down," he said, his voice low and strained. "Why?" I asked, confused. "It's just a box." He didn't respond at first, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "It's not just a box, it's something else." His tone was so serious that for a moment, I almost thought he was joking, but there was something about the way he said it, something that made me hesitate. "Just leave it," he muttered. "You don't want to know what's inside." That was enough to make me pull my hand back and set the box down. But as I did, something strange happened. The lights in the store flickered. For just a second, everything seemed to blur. And when my vision cleared, I was no longer standing in the aisle. I was standing outside in the parking lot, staring at the store from across the street. I blinked, disoriented, and suddenly I was back in the aisle, the box still in front of me. My heart raced. Had I really just seen that? "Hey!" the young man called again, stepping toward me. "I told you, you don't know what you're dealing with." Before I could respond, the door at the back of the store opened. A man in a dark suit walked in, tall, gaunt, with unnaturally pale skin. His eyes were hidden beneath dark sunglasses, and he moved with an eerie, purposeful grace. I froze, unsure of what was happening, but something told me this man was the reason the box had felt so wrong. The man didn't speak to anyone. He simply walked past the aisles, heading straight for the back corner where the box had been. When he reached it, he stopped. Slowly, he reached down and picked up the box with one hand. The entire store seemed to hold its breath. Without a word, the man turned and walked back toward the door. But just before he left, he paused and turned toward me. His expression was hidden behind the sunglasses, but I could feel his gaze on it. "You should never have touched it," he said in a voice that was almost a whisper. Then he was gone. I stood there, stunned, as the door shut behind him with a soft click. The store had gone silent. The elderly woman and the cashier didn't seem to notice anything unusual, and the lights stopped flickering. But the air felt heavier now, charged with a sense of foreboding. I didn't know what had just happened or what the man had meant. But as I stood there, something clicked in my mind. The feeling I had when I first entered the store. I'd felt watched, like something or someone was waiting. I didn't need to buy anything anymore. I quickly paid for my items and left, still holding the strange sense that something was following me. The next day, I returned to the store, my mind racing with questions. But when I reached the back aisle, the box was gone. I asked the cashier about it, but she just gave me a blank look. "There's never been a box there." I tried to ask her about the man in the suit, but she just shrugged and said she didn't know who I was talking about. I left the store in a daze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened, whatever that box was, far from over. For the last week, strange things have been happening. I hear whispers when I'm alone, whispers that seem to come from nowhere. Sometimes when I pass mirrors or reflective surfaces, I catch glimpses of a man in a suit standing just behind me. And every night, I dream of a small wooden box, strange symbol. It sits in the center of an empty room, and no matter how hard I try, I can never get closer. I don't know what the box was or who the man in the suit was, but I do know one thing. I'm being watched, and I can't escape whatever it is that's coming for me. I never planned to go to the dollar store that night. It was late, I was tired, and I had already stopped at the grocery store. But something pulled me there, a strange compulsion I couldn't explain. The moment I stepped inside, I immediately felt it. The eerie, unsettling atmosphere that hung in the air, like a thick fog. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering every few seconds, and the aisles stretched on for what seemed like miles. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of cleaning supplies and something faintly sweet, like rotten fruit. The store was practically empty, just one other person browsing the aisles. A man, probably in his early 30s, with a scruffy beard and a hood pulled low over his eyes. He didn't seem to notice me as I walked past him, but his presence was strange, like he didn't belong there. I moved through the aisles, picking up random items, trying to shake off the strange feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. That's when I saw it. A small silver box sitting on the bottom shelf, tucked away behind a stack of cheap cleaning products. It was simple, rectangular, with intricate engraving running along the edges. Something about it was off. It didn't belong in a dollar store, and it didn't belong in this world. I knelt down and picked it up, feeling an unnatural coldness seep through my fingers. The box was surprisingly heavy, and the engravings, once I got a closer look, seemed to pulse, shifting ever so slightly. My heart skipped a beat as a wave of unease washed over me. I should have put it back, but something inside me, something dark and insistent, told me I had to take it. I could hear my breath quickening as I stared at the box, hypnotized by the strange patterns. Suddenly, I was snapped out of my trance by a voice behind me. "Put it down." I spun around to find the man in the hoodie standing behind me, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling at his sides. "What?" I stammered, still holding the box in my hand. "You don't know what that is," his voice shaking. "It's dangerous." I laughed nervously to brush it off. "It's just a box, man, nothing special." But the man wasn't laughing. His expression was deadly serious. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "It's been here for years, just waiting for someone to find it. You can't take it. You have no idea what you're messing with." I didn't believe him. It was just a box, for crying out loud. A weird one, sure, but it didn't seem like anything worth getting worked up over. Still, his words lingered in my mind as I stood there, holding the box. I should have listened to him. The moment I turned around and walked toward the counter, the air around me seemed to thicken. The lights flickered again, and the entire store felt wrong, like it was closing in on me. I looked back, half expecting to see the man still watching me, but he was gone. At the counter, the cashier, a tired-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She scanned the box without a word, her movements robotic. As she handed me the receipt, I saw her eyes flicker to the box, just for a second. For a split second, her gaze seemed empty, like she wasn't really seeing me at all. I left the store quickly, clutching the box in my hand, eager to get out of that strange place. But the moment I stepped outside, I felt like something was following me. I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were on me, watching my every move. When I got home, I set the box on the kitchen table and tried to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me. But as the night wore on, the unease only grew. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind outside seemed louder and closer than it should have been. I tried to distract myself, watching TV, checking my phone, but the feeling lingered. Then I heard it, a knock, soft at first, almost imperceptible. I froze. The knock came again, louder this. It sounded like it was coming from inside the apartment. I glanced around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I stood up, my legs shaking, and slowly moved toward the source of the sound. The knock came again, this time directly from the table where the box sat. My blood ran cold. I reached for the box, my hand trembling. As I lifted it, a cold gust of wind swept through the room, and I heard a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Open it." I dropped the box in shock. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. What the hell was going on? The whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Open it. Let us out." I ran to the door, grabbing my keys and bolting out of the apartment. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get away from that box. The whispers followed me, like they were inside my head, pulling me back. I didn't stop running until I reached the dollar store again. I barged through the doors, gasping for breath, and ran straight to the back aisle, where I had found the box. But when I reached the shelf, it was gone. I asked the cashier, the same woman who had barely acknowledged me earlier, where the box was. She looked at me, her expression blank. "What box?" I stumbled back, my mind spinning. How could it be gone? I'd seen it just hours ago. As I turned to leave, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. The man in the hoodie was standing by the door, watching me. His face was pale, his eyes empty and lifeless, and he didn't move when I locked eyes with him. I rushed out of the store, but as I stepped outside, I heard the whisper again. Let us out. I don't know what the box was or who or what it was calling, but I do know one thing. It's not over. The whispers are with me, always, and no matter where I go, I can feel it waiting. I never thought anything would come of my late-night dollar store visits, but the night I encountered the strange figure in the corner, things changed forever. It was just another boring Thursday evening, and I had forgotten to grab a few things earlier in the day. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, just a quick stop for some batteries and toothpaste. The moment I stepped into the store, I was struck by the usual silence. The aisles were lit with the harsh glow of flickering fluorescent lights, casting long shadows over the rows of products. The air smelled faintly of cleaning product, but there was an odd undercurrent, something sharp and almost metallic, that set my nerves on edge. I made my way toward the back of the store, where the aisles were a little more cramped. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the stillness, but there was something else, too. A soft, scraping noise. It was faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. I paused for a moment, scanning the aisles for the source. The store was nearly empty except for an elderly man at the far end, slowly sifting through a bin of cheap toys. His hunched figure seemed to blend into the shadows, but there was no one else. The noise continued, scraping, dragging. Curiosity got the best of me, and I followed the sound deeper into the store. It led me to the farthest corner, where a display of dusty old books sat forgotten. But the scraping noise wasn't coming from the books, it was coming from behind them. I knelt down and peered into the gap between the shelves, half expecting to find a rat or something similar. But instead I saw a small, dark shape, too small to be a person, but too large to be anything I'd ever seen. A glint of glass caught my eye, and I reached forward instinctively. When my fingers closed around the object, I felt the chill seep into my bones. The object was a tiny glass jar, no more than 3 inches tall. It was perfectly smooth, with no markings or labels, just an empty glass container with a faint, oily residue lining the inside. As I held it, I felt a wave of unease flood over me. Something about it didn't feel right, but I couldn't explain why. The scraping sound ceased, and everything felt unnervingly still. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed the elderly man. He was standing perfectly still, staring directly at me. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and he wore an expression I couldn't quite place. It was a mix of fear and something darker. "Put that down," he rasped, his voice thin and tremulous. I straightened up, startled by his sudden appearance. "What? Why? You shouldn't have touched it," he whispered, his voice shaking. "You have no idea what it is." I felt my heart race. "What is it?" The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his bony fingers twitching at his sides. Then, he glanced nervously around the store, as if he feared someone was watching. "It's a curse," he muttered finally, his voice low and strained. "A curse that never lets go. You take it, and it follows you." I laughed nervously, unsure whether he was serious or just delusional, but his eyes didn't leave me. There was no hint of a joke in them, only pure terror. Before I could respond, the store's overhead lights flickered and the room seemed to shift. I felt a cold breeze rush past me, although there were no open doors or windows. The man stepped back, eyes wide with panic. "You need to leave. Now," he said, his voice cracking. I looked down at the jar in my hand again. The oily residue inside seemed to shimmer faintly, almost as if it were alive. I tried to shake the feeling that it was pulsing with some hidden force, but it was too late. The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, everything was different. The store seemed darker, the shadows deeper. The shelves were now disorganized, products knocked over, aisles that had once been neat and tidy now in chaos. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating. I tried to move, but my legs felt heavy, sluggish, as if something was holding me in place. The jar felt colder, pressing against my palm like it was alive, its weight dragging me down. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible. "Let us out." It was coming from the jar. The sound was clear now, unmistakable, like voices trapped inside, begging for. The whispers grew louder, urgent, until they became a chorus of pleading voices all at once. "Let us out! Let us out!" I dropped the jar in shock, but the voices didn't stop. They echoed in my mind, drowning out everything else. I tried to turn and run, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the presence of something around me, something dark and powerful, closing in on me from all sides. And then I saw them. The people who had been shopping earlier, the elderly man, the cashier, even the few other customers, were all standing still, frozen in place, their eyes wide open, mouths slightly agape. They weren't alive anymore. They were empty, hollow. The whispers continued, louder now. the voices pressing into my skull. I stumbled back, desperate to escape, but every time I turned, I saw nothing but dark figures. The store was no longer a store. It was a prison, a place where time and space had warped into something unrecognizable. In the distance, I saw the man who had warned me, standing at the far end of the aisle, his mouth open in a silent scream, but his eyes were empty too, just like the others. I ran. I had to get out. I had to escape. The moment I reached the door, I burst through it, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I was outside, breathless, disoriented, and terrified. I never went back to that dollar store, but sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I hear the whisper. They're still in my head begging me to open the jar, to let them out. And I can't shake the feeling that no matter how far I run, they're waiting for me.